So, what made you become a communist?
So communism is something that historically, when we learned about it in school, is something that, has that very negative connotation to it, which I think is, completely understandable with just like America's stance during the Cold War, as well as like the different impact that different leaders have had. But what really made me switch over to communism was I think it was during around the start, or actually more like the middle of the COVID pandemic when, I was in high school, later in high school, trying to get different jobs and stuff, and I was having a really difficult time with some of the jobs, like some of the working conditions weren't great, and it started to make me sort of ask questions, right? It was also during a time where you have those socially progressive movements as well, like the Black Lives Matter movement and stuff like that, and so it sort of made me start to ask those questions of why are things the way they are, and why are certain bad things, why does it have to be this way? And so I feel like the way that communism sort of analyzes these different issues from a perspective of economics and class, I think puts it in a very apt way that helped me understand, I guess, how the world works, some of the issues, and how things can potentially be better in the future.
So you mentioned the COVID pandemic. What about the COVID pandemic made you become a communist? Or you said something about during the COVID pandemic that you kind of switched political ideologies or kind of leaned more left. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so the COVID pandemic was it was something that really just changed the world and the way we live forever, you know what I mean? And we saw, each other with all of this isolation, you know what I mean? And it gave us a lot of time to kind of ponder the way things were, the way things were being handled, especially with all the different political controversies going on during the COVID pandemic, during the beginning, middle, and end. And so it just meant that there was a lot of room to just learn about different things regarding politics, you know what I mean? And so as that time sort of passed, this was also, again, I was a sophomore, junior in high school, and so this is around the time when I'm really starting to take that transition step into learning even more about politics and stuff like that. So it was kind of the perfect storm for me to sort of learn more about the different injustices that go on, and it made me learn more about communism as well. And so it sort of transitioned nicely into me eventually sort of going from being a general sort of leftist to me becoming a little bit of a communist, So it was an interesting transition for sure.
But you said you're a general leftist before the pandemic. Now, communism is more than just left, but what drove you to become a communist per se? Was there anything, being a leftist, okay, a Democrat, a socialist, or a socialist, but being a communist, that's something of its own nature. Was there anything that specifically drove you to liking communism?
Yeah, so honestly, I would say it was probably the influence that some of my friends had on me as well. Again, COVID got a lot of isolation, and so to sort of cope with that, you have people sort of reaching out to each other on social media, just having conversations virtually. And so even though we were all cooped up in our own rooms, it actually gave me the opportunity to talk to certain friends more than I ever had before, because we kind of had that time and space to really meet up with each other, even if it was virtually. And so one of my good friends, Rishi, he's actually, I believe he goes to University of Boulder, Colorado. He's a, really good guy, and he's actually a bit of a communist himself, and so as I was doing more research about politics, I would have different conversations with him about the state of the world and different affairs like that. And so being able to have that sort of community aspect to transitioning to becoming a communist was another very important part that played a role in me transitioning to, having some of those ideologies.
Was it also just your friends, or was it your family members? Because there's only a little bit of communism in America. You're not going to find too many communists walking around. So is there maybe school, or just, you said, isolation, people watching movies had communism? What was it? Because communism in itself, you're not going to walk into a lot of communists. So what more inspired you to become a communist?
Yeah, so communism is like, again, like as you said, like something that you're not really going to come across in terms of like that overall support, right? And so a lot of it, again, like it came from my friend, but other factors, like I think just in general, that sort of general mantra and that sort of general sense of like economic equality was something that I was really starting to believe in. And so I was just kind of doing my own little research about, again, those different sort of political ideologies that stand with that. And communism, with its more like sort of revolutionary stance, was something that kind of like stood out to me, you know? And so when it comes to like media and stuff, like, although like you don't have that many like movies or TV shows or like video games or whatever really like portraying some sort of like communist support, obviously, you do kind of see how different themes that you see in terms of like political commentary, for example, can kind of translate into communist ideologies. How communist ideologies can sort of like represent stuff like that. You know what I mean? For example, like when it comes to like social issues, you can look at these different social issues represented in different movies and TV shows, and by seeing that, it kind of like I started to connect the dots, and I'm like, oh, so the reason why some of these social issues exist is a result of like class and wanting to establish power. And so little things like that, a lot of different things from all kinds of different sources really connected, and I can't really pinpoint it down to one exact thing, but it's just a combination of just connecting the dots, you know what I mean?
You talk about social issues and stuff like that. I don't think you have to be a communist or even a left winger to even stand with like civil rights. I mean, I think you could be a conservative and say, hey, we need more civil rights. So I mean, I understand where you're coming from with like social issues and class structure, but I don't think you need to be exactly a communist, exactly a socialist, exactly a Democrat or a left winger to like social change, to like acknowledge social flaws. You could be a Republican and say, hey, yeah, we need to change a little bit of this. Maybe this we need to change, not this is this. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and I honestly agree, right? I feel like when it comes to stuff like equality, like you don't need to be like a hardcore communist in order to believe in things like that. I feel like honestly, it's just kind of the way the cookie crumbled with all these different influences I was kind of taking in at the time, and I guess still am, where I think anyone can believe in, like, for example, like civil rights, but then after that point, there are different ways of interpreting it, right? And so the way I interpreted a lot of civil rights issues was in that sort of very class-based, structural issue-based perspective that a lot of communists had. And so, again, like for example, like my like communist friends, like they saw that I was starting to like lean that way, and they, I guess, sort of helped me, helped raise more insight on my own perspective, and helped me sort of lean more towards that path. So while I do agree that like anyone can believe in civil rights, it's what you do with those beliefs in equality that I think can determine or like set a path for what other things you believe as well. Yeah, and to add on to that, I think really, again, I think anyone can sort of have those sort of civil rights support regardless of what your ideology is. Like for example, my uncle, he is like this really conservative guy. Like he's got the Trump 2024 coaster and stuff like that. Like he is really about that conservative lifestyle, but he's actually very much like a live and let live kind of guy. So he's actually like pretty accepting of like civil rights and like even LGBTQ rights. Like he doesn't mind it, you know what I mean? He's just, again, like sort of like a live and let live kind of guy. So I think anyone can sort of have support for civil rights. It's just what you do with it, right? Like my dad, he's a centrist, and again, he's very like socially progressive, but he's economically conservative, right? And And so he has different ideologies about like economic policies that I personally don't agree with, even though we agree on like social issues, you know what I mean? So I think, as I was saying before, like anyone can support civil rights and just equality in general, but it's what you do with that and the way you interpret that and approach it is, I think, what really matters in determining your ideology.
Okay. Tell me about your family and their perspectives, because it seems like your dad had a big impact on you.
Yeah, so my dad, he's a pretty interesting human being, obviously. He, grew up in like this super Catholic, super conservative family in rural Wisconsin, and he, when he was like in college, he started like kind of falling out with religion, right? And so he kind of broke away from that mold in which he grew up in, and was like, I'm gonna sort of like go against the grain, you know what I mean? And I think that kind of thing, even though he's like a centrist and we don't really agree on politics a lot of the time, I think that kind of idea has really influenced me in terms of just like, I guess, looking up to him as a parental figure, as well as just how he is, how he's raised me, right? Because he has always been like, and obviously my mom as well. My mom is actually a Vietnamese immigrant, and she fled South Vietnam actually during the fall of Saigon. So it makes it like even more crazy, where it's like, my family was fleeing from communism and now I'm a communism, you know what I mean? So it's kind of crazy to think about sometimes, but ultimately there's just like different levels to communism, right? But to what I was saying before, like the way my parents raised me was like, they just wanted me to be, as long as I wasn't hurting anybody, like they just wanted me to be myself, And if that meant like going against common ideologies, if that meant like having different sorts of like having a different kind of personality, like as long as I wasn't hurting anybody, like they're like more than willing to support their child. So for me, I guess the way that translated was, I guess in a lot of different ways, but it made me more comfortable in exploring other ideologies. It made me more comfortable in saying like, maybe I should hear out this group of people that like I've been told to like, avoid, you know what I mean? And that's, I guess, part of what's influenced me. I'm sure my parents didn't want me to become a communist, but at the end of the day, like, it's something that I understand, but I feel like my ideology, like, the way I practice it, I use it as a way of, like, again, practicing, like, sympathy and empathy and, like, advocating for equality in a way that, like, is not, like, I'm not, like, trying to kill anyone, you know what I mean? So, like, I think my family, to sort of wrap it up, my family has really, like, influenced me in a bit of a crazy way, but I'm very thankful for, the way they've raised me.
So, you being a communist, is that what made you sign up for the Communism in America class? To find out more what communism meant in America? Or like, how did you wind up taking the class?
Yeah, so that's actually exactly why I ended up registering for the class, because I was looking through, I was on pause, and like, you got the different class titles, and I just see like, Communism in America, and I'm like, yo, that's crazy. And so I was really interested in joining the class, just starting conversations with different people, and even just learning more about myself, as learning more about my ideology and the history behind it. Because I think like when it comes to the American Communist Party, it's one of those parts of American history that doesn't really get talked about, but like Loki had like a pretty massive impact. Whether it's good or bad is obviously up to debate. But it's been a very interesting class, and it was actually a class that that was the one class that I really wanted to take, because like I saw that and I was like, it just like really stood out to me. So it's been fun being in that class for sure.
So a lot more people nowadays are becoming interested in politics, and well, especially the younger generation. On the flip side though, there's people who, well, want to learn more about politics, but aren't necessarily interested in it. Like, for example, there's a student here at TCNJ. His name is Jeremy Silverglass. He's a political science major, but he isn't actually interested in politics. So I'm interested, what are your thoughts on his decision to major in political science, and even though he's not interested in politics?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I mean, first of all, I hope Jeremy's doing well. That's something that's very interesting to me. That's not something I've necessarily heard that much about. I think generally speaking, most of the people that I've talked to, that care about politics, they generally are very interested in doing some sort of advocacy work at the very least, if not actually being a part of the political system. So to be a poli-sci major but not really interested in being in the political scene is pretty interesting to me. But honestly, yeah, so I think it's very interesting that a poli-sci major would be not that interested in politics, but at the same time, I kind of understand, right? If you're the type of person that doesn't have a lot of faith in the political system that America has, I can completely understand if you're more interested in using poli-sci just as a means of learning and just gaining more of a cultural perspective, rather than trying to be a politician or try to work in an advocacy organization. So it's something that's on one hand is kind of odd to me, but at the same time, I think at the very least it's cool that he wants to learn more, and I think if he has a vision of what he wants to do in the future, then that's completely valid. So yeah.
So in the class, what you like learning about? What period did you like learning about, or what type, or who, or what did you like learning about? Was there a leader that you liked? Was there an idea that you liked? Was there anything that you liked in that class?
Yeah, no, I think there are a lot of different things interesting about the history of American communism. But I think in particular, I found the Popular Front to be pretty fascinating. The way that communism and communist members and leaders were trying to assimilate those ideologies into modern American culture at the time. I found that really interesting, the way that they went about it, and there were different pros and cons. I feel it probably could have happened earlier, and maybe it could have been done in a slightly better way. But I think it's overall something very interesting, just making communism more accessible to the general public, because I feel that is part of what made me today a bit of a communist, because you sort of have these general themes and people around me that sort of in a very accessible way help portray communism in again this accessible way that helped me really start to believe some of the general mantras and ideologies.
Was there any piece of text that reinforced you becoming a communist? Was there anything that you read, or Browder, or any other leader that you said, yeah, this is why I became a communist? This is why. Was it leaders in the Popular Front, or the second wave, or the first wave? Was there any specific text that reinforced your saying, yeah, this is why I became a communist?
I think what made me really sort of believe yeah, this is why I feel the way I do is honestly some of the poems during the Popular Front. I think a lot of the literary work, the more artistic ways of expressing different communist ideologies was really what helped me feel yeah, this is stuff that I believe in, this is stuff that I mess with. I think a lot of the art at the time, even though I feel maybe it could have been marketed in a better way, maybe if this and that happened, I feel ultimately the ACP movement definitely had its issues, and I feel fell apart for reasons that probably could have been solved with a bit more cooperation and stuff like that. But the things that did happen, the artistic expression that we saw, I think was something that was really endearing and really genuine, and it was something that I resonated with pretty strongly, even several decades, nearly 100 years later. So I feel like those more artistic pieces are, what helped reinforce my own beliefs.
What's your favorite poem?
I think that "Let America Be America" by Langston Hughes was a poem that really resonated strongly with me. Just sort of that talks about sort of combining both social struggles with racism and things like that with the economic struggles of the class divide and things like that. I think that was something that it really spoke to me. And Langston Hughes, just one of the most iconic writers in American history. So it was really I think it was that poem in particular that I think really hit for me, and I ended up really enjoying that piece in particular. And yeah.
Has your opinions on communism changed at all from saying, yes, this is what I believe, this is what I stand for, or, ooh, this is, alright, some of my beliefs are kind of flawed maybe, alright, not so much of a strong communism anymore that I used to, it could kind of dial it up or dial it down?
If I'm being honest with you, I don't think my stance on communism really changed a ton. I think I just gained more insight. I think things kind of balanced out in a way. I gained more knowledge that made me support communism, with the different pieces of art, the poems as I mentioned before, really helped reinforce that idea in my mind. But at the same time, some of the mistakes that the ACP made, just with some of the espionage stuff going on, and some of the sort of nefarious treatment of certain people of color during the time, it also made me well, I'm not too sure if I mess with that, And so it's really comes down to throughout all the different flaws, I think at the end of the day, even though the ACP and communist regimes in general have been very flawed, I think the principles at the end of the day still hold strong. Because when I think of communism, I think of the people just as sort of everyday citizens that just have a pure heart and want to just make the world a better place. And that sort of translates in a more revolutionary style, but I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that, as long as, again, you're not hurting anybody unnecessarily, obviously. I think communism just stands for, that class struggle, that, that unity throughout the struggle. And so, as I mentioned before, you had some of those flaws that made me a little bit unsure, but at the same time, you had, those really beautiful pieces of art, whether it's the music, the poems, the drawings and paintings. There's a lot of different things, and it all kind of balanced out in the end. So I think by the end of it, I, learned more, and I think I feel just as comfortable saying that I'm a little bit of a communist, So it's been interesting.
Thank you, Noah, for your insight on this.
Thank you. I really appreciate the conversation. I thought it was a lot of fun. It was not expected. Yeah, no, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
Yes, I learned much about what's inside the mind of communists.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, again, thank you so much.
Give it up, audience. On the Chilean president from the 1970s.
Yeah, so during the 1960s, if I'm not mistaken, Salvador Allende was a sort of working class president who kind of just checked all the boxes for the things you would want in an ideal communist leader. He focused a lot on just again, supporting the working class with accessible healthcare and improving different working conditions and just optimizing the industrialization of the country. He did a lot of really good stuff in the 2-3 years that he was the leader of Chile. Unfortunately, because you saw this sort of rising communist nation, during the height of the Cold War, Chile was obviously
viewed as a pretty big threat potentially. And so we did see the CIA throw a military coup on Chile, where Salvador Allende unfortunately ended up committing suicide. And yeah, it was really unfortunate, but I think like those like 2 to 3 years of time where like things were really looking a lot better for Chile kind of served as like this little beacon of hope, in my opinion, for communism, because I think it really shows like a lot. The common argument is that like, oh, communism might work on paper, but like in practice it doesn't really work out. But I feel like what Salvador Allende did for Chile during those 1960s era, where he was doing it, he wasn't even doing it in like a super like revolutionary radical sense either. Like it was like a pretty gradual just use of like good policy decisions that led to a more communist state where like things were actually working out well. So I think he is sort of like the prime example of like communism can work in practice.
Who's your favorite leader from the American communism? Is it Earl Browder, or who would you make your favorite? Do you have?
I don't have a particularly like favorite leader from the American Communist Party. I think every leader had their own set of like good things they were doing, but also some flaws that were like kind of iffy. Like I have pretty mixed feelings on all the communist leaders of the ACP. I will say, in terms of communism, like as a whole and in general, we have seen communist leaders like Salvador Allende in Chile back in the 1960s, if I'm not mistaken. He really helped his nation turn around for the better up until the CIA threw a military coup on that country, which was not very fun. But you know, for the time being, like leaders like Salvador Allende really like did a pretty solid job of like turning things around for their people. So while I'm not super crazy about any leader of the American Communist Party in particular, there are certain leaders throughout history that I would say I do rock with.
Expand more on the McCarthyism and that type of subject. Expand on that more.
So as we know, McCarthy back in the day, he was like, oh, all of these different people are like big communists and they're trying to like take over the government and stuff like that, which was like, you know, not necessarily true. And it led to sort of just a witch hunting of trying to find like who were these communists that were trying to like take over the government and create complete chaos and stuff like that. And what that led to is, you know, as we've learned, a lot of different trials for, you know, people that literally did not do anything, but you know, people were scared that, oh, like anyone could be a communist. So even just like the slightest thing that could be interpreted as a hint was taken as like a warning sign. And so we saw a lot of innocent people get, you know, fired from their jobs and like completely like economically like blacklisted pretty much. And it had pretty devastating results for, you know, a lot of hardworking families. And it was a really just unfortunate situation. And although like it is definitely true that like there were like some communists that were doing like espionage, for example, and obviously the concerns for that are completely valid, but the massive overreaction to say like, oh, anyone could be a communist is like, it was pretty ridiculous and has only continued to like age worse with time as we look back on it.